Now, some of you might recall just 3 weeks ago, ASME hosted an online town hall featuring the chief scientist of the International Space Station National Lab. During that event, we learned about the value of low Earth orbit as a technological platform and the lab's role in maintaining US global competitiveness, speaking exactly to what we just heard from Representative Kim. Well, now today we are fortunate to welcome a panel of speakers who are focused on how to utilize low Earth orbit to advance the future of healthcare and create more personalized and accessible treatments for all. Our panel moderator is Dr. Kevin Costa, Director of Cardiovascular Cell and Tissue Engineering at the Mount Sinai Icahn School of Medicine and Chair of the ASME Bioengineering Public Policy Task Force. Fun fact, Dr. Costa is also preparing to send an experiment up to the ISS National Lab focusing on tissue-on-chip technology. Kevin, take it away.
Thanks so much, Anne. And also thanks to Congressman Kim for the wonderful support for the efforts on ISS and for STEM education. I just want to say that I'm pleased to be joined by such an esteemed group of professionals here today to discuss this exciting topic of biomanufacturing in low Earth orbit. Quickly is Dr. Siobhan Malany, Associate Professor of Pharmacodynamics in the College of Pharmacy at the University of Florida. We also have Dr. Asha Balakrishnan, who is a research staff at the Science and Technology Policy Institute in Washington, D.C. Marc Giulianotti, who's a senior manager in space manufacturing at Sierra Space. And until about a month ago, Marc was the senior program director at the Center for Advanced Science in Space, or CASIS, which manages the ISS National Lab. So I think to help you get to know each of them better, I'd like to ask each panelist just to briefly introduce yourself and say a few words, particularly about your relationship to the topic of biomanufacturing in space. Siobhan, why don't we start with you?
Okay, great. Thank you. My name is Siobhan Malany. I am a drug discovery pharmacologist, started my career in the biotech high throughput screening world. Now I'm a faculty member at University of Florida and started micro-gRX. And so I've had 4 payloads go to the space station. We're also sending a payload up on June 7th on SpaceX 25. And we've been focused on this lab on a chip technology. We're going to talk a lot more about that, I think. But essentially, it's taking human cells in a microfluidic device, and we're looking at muscle cells from different donors. We integrate that with space hardware and mechanics in this automated system, send that to space station, and we're using microgravity as a fundamental platform to look at the changes in the cell level, particularly looking at a accelerated atrophy or muscle wasting signature, and then using microgravity as an applied research platform too, which we're going to expand on here, looking at disease modeling and tissue engineering. And so these are the fun, exciting things we're going to talk about. So really looking forward to it. Thanks for the invite.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Siobhan. Next, I'd like to ask Dr. Asha Balakrishnan to introduce herself.
Hi, everybody. My name is Asha Balakrishnan. Thank you for inviting me to this panel. I am the Assistant Director at the Science and Technology Policy Institute and support a number of studies, policy research studies at the Office of Science and Technology Policy. I am not a biomanufacturing microgravity researcher, but I'm very excited to see that ASME is starting to be a little bit more involved in the issues of space and space policy. I myself have been doing a lot more work in space policy as of late, particularly on orbital debris and policies around on the impacts and what the US government's going to do to, and the world honestly is going to do about orbital debris. As many of you might know, the station has had to actually maneuver out of the way of debris a few times in the last few years. And with things like the Russian ASAT and other breakups that are happening in space, I think that there's a lot of concern that there's going to be more of that. Another topic I've been focusing on lately is on orbit. It's not called on orbit servicing, assembly, and manufacturing anymore. They recently changed that in a recent strategy called in space servicing, assembly, and manufacturing, ISAM, which is really to be doing things that mechanical engineers do a lot really well terrestrially, but to actually start doing them in space, which I'm really excited about and hoping ASME can get more involved and their members can get more involved in some of the work that's happening in ISAM. So thank you very much for inviting me, and I look forward to this discussion.
Excellent, thank you. And I would also just mention that Asha is is a former congressional fellow of ASME.
Yes, I am a former congressional fellow. I'm sorry. Thanks to ASME for sponsoring me as a congressional fellow on the House Science Committee Subcommittee on Space, which the Congresswoman was just talking about that committee and was really very honored to be part of that group for a year.
Asha. And then last but not least, Dr. Giulianotti. Marc, could you introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you, Kevin, and thank you everyone for the invitation to join here today. This is pretty exciting to be able to speak to this group and to speak about what's ahead. I think this is stuff that maybe was only science fiction 5-10 years ago, and is really kind of transforming the way we're thinking about doing things, both here on Earth, but also beyond Earth. So it's exciting. In 5-10 years ago, I wasn't even involved in the space industry. I was like Siobhan, I was in drug discovery and joined CASIS, as you mentioned, the company that manages the national lab through an agreement with NASA. I joined them 6 years ago and really focused on the biomanufacturing part of the portfolio. So working on the tissue chip projects that both Kevin and Siobhan are part of. So with our collaborations with the National Institutes of Health and the National Science Foundation, as well as a lot of the commercial companies. And as you mentioned, Kevin, I guess it's been 4 weeks. I joined Sierra Space. And similarly to what Congresswoman was mentioning, is our reliance on foreign use of the Soyuz rocket through Russia. So there was really the desire to have NASA get services from US providers. So as everybody's familiar, SpaceX and Northrop Grumman are some of the suppliers now that enable us to get our research and people to the space station. And Sierra Space is also one of those providers that will have a capability, as well as one of the commercial LEO destination providers of the future. So we are part of the ecosystem that is helping to transition off of ISS.
Awesome. Thanks very much, Marc. And then again, as Ann mentioned, my name is Kevin Costa. I'm chair of the ASME Bioengineering Public Policy Task Force. I'm an associate professor of medicine and cardiology here at the Icahn School of Medicine in New York City, where I direct a program in cardiovascular cell and tissue engineering. And I'm delighted to say that I have an ongoing project funded by the National Science Foundation and CASIS to send a new microfluidic cardiovascular chip to the space station to study the effects of microgravity on these mini human heart and mini human vessel organoids created from human stem cells. This is really a model of stiffness-related cardiovascular diseases associated with spaceflight, both for spaceflight for astronauts as well as relevant to the aging population here on Earth. And I think that's another important theme, is how the ISS supports not just science for astronauts, but science for for mankind. So I just want to remind everyone watching that we'll be taking questions. So please submit your questions through the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. But to kind of warm things up a little bit and start the conversation, I'd like to start off by, that we'll be discussing this exciting topic, an important topic of biomanufacturing in low Earth orbit. We keep talking about LEO, and maybe just to define what that is, low Earth orbit. This is orbiting at an altitude of less than about 2 kilometers, or about 1,200 miles above Earth. This is where most of the satellites and the other artificial objects are. So as Asha was saying, there's a lot of garbage up there as well. And basically these items are circling Earth at a pace of about once every 1.5 hours. The major difference from terrestrial operations is microgravity compared to ionizing radiation and some of the other challenges that are relevant to deep space exploration. Microgravity is really the key on the space station in LEO. And this happens because the gravity at that level is not zero. Actually, gravity is almost 90% of gravity here on Earth, but the space station itself is in free fall, accelerating down at about the same acceleration as gravity, so that the net is zero, and you have this effect of weightlessness. So there are aircraft here for astronaut training and so forth. You might have heard of something called the Vomit Comet. It basically uses a parabolic flight path to achieve a similar effect for a few seconds. On the other hand, the ISS has been in operation, as we heard, for over 20 years, with continuous occupation by humans working and living in space. So it's really a very unique environment, and this is what we're here to talk about today. As Anne mentioned, ASME recently welcomed Mike Roberts, the Chief Scientist of the International Space Station National Lab, to discuss the role of low Earth orbit as a technology platform, which dovetails nicely with today's ASME Anything event. Also, Dr. Giulianotti was one of the lead organizers of a related workshop on biomanufacturing in low Earth orbit, which ran over a couple of months in this past fall, bringing together key opinion leaders from academia, industry, medicine, NASA, FDA, to lay out sort of a roadmap for biomanufacturing in LEO as a sustainable enterprise. And I think Marc will be talking a little bit more about that today. It was a connection between that workshop and the ASME Bioengineering Public Policy Task Force that's what led to today's event. And I just want to quickly point out that the ASME, American Society of Mechanical Engineers, is also an international organization, serving over 90,000 members from over 135 countries, with 35 technical divisions, including aerospace division, bioengineering division, manufacturing engineering division. So very relevant to today's talk, and a perfect pairing between the two. The goal for today is to inform the ASME members and the other audience members about the exciting advances and opportunities in relation to biomanufacturing in LEO, to understand the potential and the challenges for research and commercialization in LEO, and to recognize the benefits of this unique environment for mankind, not just for space exploration, but also life in here on Earth. And we really want to get you, the audience, excited and energized about this important topic, both for your own professional interests and also so you're informed during your congressional visits and other interactions that you might have with your communities and your representatives. And so with that, why don't we start off the discussion? And I'd like to start actually by asking Marc maybe to just briefly introduce us to the ISS and maybe identify some key milestones or achievements over the past 22 years that are relevant specifically to biomanufacturing.
You'd think after 2.5 years, I'd figure out the mute button, right? So, yeah, so it's as you guys have mentioned, the ISS, one of the milestones that people like to celebrate a couple of years ago is that been 20 years of continuous habitation by humans. So that was always fun when you'd go to high school groups and you'd say, all of you have lived in a world that has always had humans in space. So that's definitely a milestone, and it speaks to the collaborative nature of the ISS. And I think that's a big part of, obviously what ASME is involved in. And when I think about the engineering that went into designing the ISS, which took input from several different nations to assemble this 5-bedroom facility, is like what we like to describe it, in space, is pretty impressive. And I think it speaks to the engineering community that can accomplish tasks like that. And it's exciting to see this just move off into the commercial sector now. So all of the work that's gone into the ISS has really led to the continued development of, aerospace engineering, and then all the way to biomechanical engineering. And so I think some of the milestones is seeing it both assembled and then starting to be used as a research facility. I think it was always envisioned that it could be a platform that could be utilized to understand human health in space. But over the past 2 decades, to see it really being transformed and show that real research that has an impact here on Earth can take place. And I'd say that really over the last 10 plus years, not to toot the horn of cases in the National Lab, but Congress did establish NASA, or the ISS, at least a portion of it, to be utilized as a national lab and to get access to non-NASA utilization, which I think has been a great addition to the use of the ISS, and has obviously brought Kevin and Siobhan into utilizing it. And I think in the beginning, people wondered if there was going to be uses for the space station that people would be interested in. And over the past decade, we've seen that there's been a tremendous growth in that use. At CASIS, I know We are actually oversubscribed all the time, as Kevin and Siobhan can probably speak to. They have to fight to get access, which speaks to the fact that researchers are continuously wanting to do research. And that spans not only our government agencies, but also a lot of commercial agencies. And to really start to now get to the point where we can understand what this unique environment can do for us. And so as Kevin was mentioning, the real unique nature of this facility is the sustained microgravity presence. So as researchers, I think it's one of those variables that we may have never thought that we could adjust is go from less than 1G for a sustained amount of time. But I think as we're starting to understand more about systemic biology and also at the cellular level, the impact of the mechanobiology has a tremendous interlay with how cells, as well as the complete environment, in vivo environment, actually performs. And so being able to develop these technologies that we can study the cardiovascular system, which both Siobhan and Kevin are doing, this is going to be important if we do want to have a presence living and working in space, but we're also understanding that this potentially can lead to breakthroughs in disease pathology and therapeutic discovery here on Earth. So I think for me, just seeing that progression to where we're at, and we're really thinking of what it means to have a full-scale, long-term research and development, as well as manufacturing capability in LEO is pretty exciting.
Excellent. Thanks, Mark. Yeah, I mean, I think one question is sort of, what is it about microgravity that has any relevance to what we're doing, to our health and existence here on Earth? Siobhan, maybe you can comment on why this is the right place to do your experiments, and maybe also just sort of touch on, this is work that you had started in your laboratory and then had adapted in some way for work on the ISS. Maybe you could comment on what that involved.
Yeah, sure. Well, I got into space for space. I mean, I was sort of milling around Kennedy Space Center after I came to Florida in 2011 at the end of the shuttle period, and just sort of, fly on a wall, listening to workshops and orbital flights. And then there's some folks talking about new technology will be on the ISS and possibility of experimentation. So I actually was like, okay, so what can I do on the space station, as opposed to having specific research? So I sort of developed the research with from the curiosity, from the opportunity, and started to talk with Space Florida, and they have the Israel Florida Innovation Program, and so we started with Space Pharma looking at these cube labs and lab on a chip, and we've done worked with Advent Health with muscle, and so there's on the shuttle period there were experiments with actually bird muscle that showed protein synthesis changed, at that level, at that tissue level. And so this really brought the idea, well, what's happening with cells, and can we understand, is there a gene expression footprint that is like an accelerated aging process, just like you're looking at cardiovascular? So can we develop this disease model? Can we get information that could benefit health on Earth? And then start using these platforms for drug efficacy testing, toxicity. We're looking at a natural product that has a anti-atrophy gene expression profile that we're going to test in October on the space station. We're looking at supplements. And so this really opens up this whole area of applied research and potential commercialization, repurposing, or we're also looking at different donors. So we have a younger group and an older group of muscle biopsy cells that we create these 3D tissue. So now, and there is evidence that these cells will retain that intrinsic characteristic of their donor. So now you're combining the stress of microgravity with donor-specific cells. You get into that patient-specific response. So on station, if you're looking at this this aging process or accelerated changes, just similar to cardiovascular. So, and many different tissues can respond this way, and immune responses, these dysfunctions. So it's really an exciting area. And then now you add the possibility to bioprint this tissue and create more volumetric tissue that could be used for transplantation. And you really start to be completely disruptive to, healthcare and having a real impact on clinical, on the clinical area to bring these technologies back to earth and really solve some issues in healthcare.
Yeah, interesting. So I actually came a little bit of a different way. I always was fascinated by space, but being kind of, first of all, having extreme myopia and being kind of old now, I figured chances as an astronaut were basically non-existent. And so it was, upgrading through the work that I was doing in my laboratory on the cardiovascular organoids and hearing about this CHIPS in space that was being sponsored by the National Institutes of Health originally. We decided to put in a grant for that. We didn't get the first grant, but then the National Science Foundation came up with a call the following year in collaboration with CASIS that was really targeting mechanobiology as a key target of the research, and it just fit really well with our project. So we resubmitted and got lucky the second time, and we're really excited about this opportunity. When you say accelerated aging, I hear numbers like 6 months in space is equivalent to 10 years of aging on Earth, which is really a very unique kind of platform. Then if you're interested in aging related diseases, you don't have to wait to start for the duration of the lifetime of a system, whether it's an animal or an in vitro system, to start to look at those aging related changes. This and the other sort of kind of strange aspect of that, especially when you think about like heart failure and things like this, a lot of these diseases, arthritis, are kind of a downward, one-way downward spiral. Once they start, you're sort of doomed, and you need intervention of treatment or sometimes organ replacement and so forth. But when you come back from space, that seems to have this unusual ability for astronauts to kind of recover when they are back on Earth. And so it really does create a unique environment to study these disease processes in a very special way. And so
thankfully it's reversible, right? I mean, because there's some harsh changes that occur, but for research, it's a great way to exploit the microgravity. But thankfully the astronaut can come back and it's reversible. But then we have deep space, living in space and deep space, and so we need to be looking long term for some of these changes, especially in immune responses and dysfunction.
Yeah.
So lots of good opportunity. But yeah, the aging it's a billion-dollar healthcare burden. So sarcopenia is age-related atrophy, and so that's what we're trying to tackle and trying to investigate.
I had mentioned NIH, NSF. There are other sources of funding potentially. Maybe I can throw a question out to Asha in terms of what sorts of funding is available for this kind of research. I know there was some discussion of this a new Office of Space Commerce under the Department of Commerce that was discussed in yesterday's panel by Dr. Locascio. Maybe you can comment on the government's priorities in space and funding these kinds of efforts.
Sure, thank you. So I would start off by saying that, the government, the National Space Council, and OSTP, on behalf of the Biden administration and the federal government, did put out a space priorities framework back in November, I believe, and there were a number of priorities for the government in terms of space, and building a vibrant commercial space sector and supporting one was among those. And so the Office of Space Commerce is their role, is to support the commercial sector in developing and advancing technologies and capabilities in space. When we come to talking about kind of microgravity R&D and the different ways in which the government has supported that, if you step back and you think, okay, where are all the different places you could do microgravity R&D? I think traditionally there's been sort of drop towers and parabolic flights, more kind of ground-based terrestrial. There's suborbital vehicles like sounding rockets and sounding balloons and other types of suborbital flight vehicles. And then there's space-based assets, right? And so we've, seen Skylab and Mir and Shuttle and all of those things. And then we came to the world of the International Space Station. And I sort of, I don't want to, so if I was just going to step back and say, okay, this is basically a facility in space, right? We build wind tunnels, we build, all sorts of facilities on the ground. And this was originally conceived as a international project with a lot of different nations building a facility in space. And when you look at the ISS, there's sort of the international segments, and then there's the US segment. And I would certainly, Mark, if I get this wrong, please do jump in. But, in the US segment, there is NASA has a portion of that they fund for their research to understand the human health, right? They study their astronauts, they study aging, they look at twins, and they look and see what happens with, one staying on longer than the other. And they do a lot of really amazing research. And interestingly enough, maybe it's not interesting to you all, but that funding for that kind of research, that biophysical research, has actually now moved under the Science Mission Directorate at NASA. It used to be part of the Human Space Flight, and now it's moved under the Science Mission Directorate. So it's really basic research oriented. And then there's the ISS National Lab, and CASIS is the managing organization for the ISS National Lab. So for those of you on this call who understand the DOE National Labs, you know that Battelle is the managing organization for the Pacific Northwest National Lab. So in the same way, CASIS is the managing organization for the ISS National Lab. And the ISS, at least the US segment, is owned and operated by NASA, essentially, right? And so CASIS and the ISS National Lab are a little bit of a clearinghouse, if you will, for research that goes up on the non-NASA research segment, right? So NASA has their research, and this is the non-NASA research segment. And so the other agencies fall into that. So when you get a grant from NSF or DOE, you are getting it through, I believe you're getting it through CASIS, and you're going up on the non-NASA part of the ISS National Lab. And so we did some work on looking at kind of who is, what's the breakdown? And I'm sure CASIS has reports on this, but I think at least what we came up with was about 43% of the investigations were from the private sector, 20% from academia, and 37% from government. What I don't know is if that 20% is academic funded, or is that like DOE funded or NSF funded for academia itself. So I think when it comes to the commercialization part, that's the private sector part. That's that 43%, and they are funding themselves to go up and do research on station. Now, one thing that, again, the ASME kind of participants in this may not know is that it's the astronauts that are actually doing the research, right? Like, they are the ones conducting the experiments on behalf of the researchers on the ground. So that's another piece of this, where if you can imagine ceding control to, very smart and capable people, but might not be biophysicists or mechanical engineers, and you have to set up your experiment so that someone else who isn't necessarily trained to do your research is able to execute your research. So I didn't really answer your question exactly. I apologize, Kevin, but I sort of got a bunch of things in there. So.
Well, you hit on some really important issues, actually, and I think one of the things that kind of, well, two actually. Why don't we start with the more technology focused one, which was your comment about the astronauts having to do this work. One of the things, and maybe Mark, you can comment on this in terms of the outcomes from the workshop last fall, in terms of what were some of the priorities that are going to be necessary, or milestones that are going to be necessary in order to make these experiments on the ISS and in other LEO types of vehicles both feasible. It might be that not all of these vehicles are manned vehicles, in fact, and secondly, the return on investment for these kinds of experiments. How do we sort of where does that stand right now? How will it be? How will it change with the commercial partners now getting involved? And how do you convince investors that this is something worth putting their money to? So, Mark, maybe you can jump on that.
Yeah, that's a lot. That's a lot in one question there. All right, so I'll start with the easy ones, right? What do we do about an astronaut doing our experiments for us? So I think this is a good question, and it's definitely one of the outcomes from the work that both you and Siobhan helped with through the symposium. Is I think the reality is the ISS, as we've discussed, wasn't necessarily designed as a research platform, and you know, I would be interested to hear, you know, Kevin and Siobhan's more opinions on what they think are the improvements needed. I mean, as a scientist myself, it's not like a lab that we're used to working in that you can just go in daily and tweak experiments, right? You have to plan, you know, months to years in advance to get a certain set of data. So I think one of the major things that we want to see over the course of the remainder of the ISS as we start to transition to the commercial stations, and this is where companies like Sierra can work with the ISS and NASA, is to really start to develop the technologies that we can have iterative type science, so science that is continuously generating data. And then the question for automation is a good one, because there's definitely trade-offs, as I think we're all aware, with fully automated versus semi-automated systems. But I think this is one of the things that provides this big benefits that's tangential to doing this work in space. I think that as industries, when we're working with biomanufactured materials and we are trying to develop standards across industry that enable reproducibility, enable us to get through FDA regulation, enable us to have non-experts actually produce materials, which is ultimately what we will want, is we need to develop technologies that could be autonomously controlled and operated. So, you know, and the other major advantage, I think, to designing for space is that you're designing for as light and as miniaturized as possible, which is, you know, definitely the miniaturization side has some immediate terrestrial benefit return. So these are all technologies that I think there's this great overlap when we think about designing for use in station. Now, I think then the second part of that over this next decade is having those capabilities will really be able to start to tease out where the long-term commercial impact is going to come from. So I think as you both know, working in a disease model in space, you know, pharmaceuticals is $1 trillion worldwide business. There's 20% of that goes back into R&D every year. And coming up with novel ways to understand disease mechanisms and druggable targets is a huge part of that process. Now, if microgravity can reveal those pathways in a unique way and a time scale that just can't be achieved here on Earth, there's definitely a return of value there to the commercial sector. So the question is, you know, how do we get the technologies to enable that type of research? And I think it goes beyond just the disease modeling. Siobhan talked on it a little bit. I think there's some evidence that there's some unique fabrication capabilities that we can do in microgravity when we remove gravity. So when you're either making unique scaffoldings or potentially taking advantage of a lack of gravity impact on defections on some sort of processes, there's definitely going to be cell maturation and expansion. Certain cell types will definitely favor a microgravity environment over a terrestrial environment. So it's really having the capabilities to flush out which are the areas that the commercial industry is going to value and continue to follow on. So, and in that process, there's going to be avenues for all these public-private partnerships, continued interaction with NASA and other government agencies as we see some of these synergistic uses for these platforms. So I tried to answer all of your questions.
Yeah.
So Siobhan, yeah, I wonder if you could comment there.
Jump in. Yeah, I mean, one of the things I have over the last 6 years is really investing in complete automated systems, and it's challenging. If it sounds hard, it's harder because we've had our share of failures. It's difficult. You have complex biology and it's miniaturized microfluidics. You're you have implementation partners that are working on the space hardware and the mechanics, and we have contraction going on with our muscle bundles, so we're electrically stimulating them. And so there's a lot in this cUBE laboratory. But in investing in that, it's to be able to do these longer term without astronaut intervention. And so it's been a long-term investment. But as we prioritize what to work on and what's more commercializable in LEO, I think we'll see more implementation. I mean, I think that the greatest sort of risk to mission success is this integration of biology hardware. It really is challenging, and even if you have great communication, because you're advancing subsystems on the engineering side, you're advancing them on the biology side, and for the tissue chip world, I really see us advancing more, creating more of a smart chip where we have more design integrated into that chip that could be a little bit more universal, so that we're testing it in the same environment of a cUBE lab, rather than coming together and doing a verification test after we've advanced both sides. I see that that integration and implementation causes the longest delays, on ground before you find out what you don't know when you come together and put these biology and hardware together. And so I think we can continue to have our lessons learned from this and develop better implementation for tissue chip platforms. I mean, these may be used on the lunar system, on habitat, and they need to be remote controlled and be automated. So I see an advantage in continuing to grow this type of hardware engineering. And this is where, engineers are really needed. I would love more engineers, in my camp, so that we understand what we don't know and we can better integrate these systems, because I think we can do them better. So as we look for more longer term, 6 months and 1 year, looking at how the effects on tissues and for deep space exploration and for chronic diseases, right? And as Marc's saying, I think that there'll be more, Marc and I have come from the high throughput screening world where we have automation. We do this really well on ground. So taking these same form factors that could be, are sterilized systems for human use and FDA compliant, and taking these that are standard on ground, using these kind of automated systems on these service providers to do these iterative process. I think we'll see more of that on the Axiom, on the aerospace systems that could at least be a little more automated. And we may have more science technicians going to space rather than astronauts. So I think it's going to change in this new space.
Yeah, it's kind of remarkable when even a process as simple as pipetting fluid into a dish doesn't work in microgravity. The fluid sort of floats around, we've also been involved in some robotics and automation development. And one of the things that excites me about that partly is the potential for that to have an impact back here on Earth. I mean, of course, there are, in big pharma, there's, multi-million-dollar, automated pipette handling, devices and automated imaging and things like this, but that's not really accessible and practical for most research labs, I would say. And so the idea that small automated systems develop out of necessity for an environment like space could also have a major impact, collateral impact, I guess, back here on Earth by making those laboratories more automated. And I think it's not just about students not having to come on weekends. I mean, really, what we know and understand about developmental biology, we know that things happen, dramatic changes occur on the time course of hours during development. And the reality of doing this kind of work in the lab is that you're doing work that's sort of technician-centric rather than cell-centric, right? Where you're changing media at 9 a.m. or at 5 p.m. or whatever time, but not at 1:30 in the morning, because it's just not practical, even if it turns out that would have been an optimal time to do so. And so I think with these automated systems that would have that flexibility to monitor cells and tissues, to use AI and other types of automated technology to make decisions about when things should be when fluid should be delivered, say, and to automate that process in a cell-centric way, we may actually learn new things about on the biology side as well. Which I
so Kevin, so one thing, we have pipetted on station, so you can do that. So surface tension takes over. So there are some capabilities. But I was wondering, in your guys' academic labs, so I would say that, you know, working in the biomanufacturing in space arena, I've never seen so many different engineers have to work together. I mean, is this something that's happening at, you know, at your universities, trying to integrate all the different engineering disciplines? I know, like, I mean, you've got to bring together software engineers, electrical engineers, mechanical engineers, bio engineers. I mean, is the integration working well, or is there still lots of gaps there?
I can speak for, you know, my own lab. I think so. My training is in bioengineering, and so that's sort of a cross-disciplinary training anyway. But one interesting thing that I found was when I was in a biomedical engineering department was that a lot of, you know, the folks that I was working with were other biomedical engineers. And interestingly, since I've moved my lab to a medical school where there's actually not an engineering department, what I found myself was drawing on people with expertise, as you're describing, not because they were in my department, which actually is cardiology, not because they had a specific engineering capability, but because they had the skills that were needed for the particular problems we were trying to solve. So we have a physicist, we have a surgeon, we have a biomaterials person, we have a computer scientist, and it's bringing those different disciplines together. I think that really make these kinds of technological advances possible, because no one, you know, expert knows it all. That's my experience anyway. Siobhan?
Yeah. As a PI, you become a program manager more than anything, right? I want to stop doing the actual detailed science, and it's very much monitoring the program and the different the groups that have to come together to really integrate these complex research on station. But I think there's a huge advantage and opportunity for bioengineers and engineers, mechanical engineers, to develop these systems, you know, better, that take less time to integrate, that is more plug and play, if you will, for what we want to do. So I think there's huge opportunities for engineers to be on these Cube Lab systems, and for even these larger platforms. I see even contract research organization opportunities in space for doing some of these iterative testing. For me, I hope these tissue chips, you know, there's a lot of rodent studies done. And for a while, you couldn't get on these flights because the rodent studies took precedence. So I'd like to see that decrease and see pharma use these tissue chips, but we need more data, right? We need to prove these systems are, in fact, giving us signatures of accelerated aging, and we need statistics and reproducibility, and you know, more flights. And I think more of these service providers providing opportunity to do research in space is gonna get us there in this decade of results, right? And so that we can eventually reduce the reliance on these rodent studies and use these human tissue functional units.
I think that's key for the audience to understand, is that these micro systems are human specific. They're human based. They're isolated in a lot of ways. It's a heart or a liver or something like that. And so I think one of the important advances will be starting to integrate those different kinds of organs and tissues. But I think that can be done also. There's a lot of you know, exciting work going on in that area. Mechanical engineers partly involved in developing new bioreactor systems that are used for creating and stimulating these tissues and culturing them. Yeah, we have a ways to go before we can replace everything that animals can do. But the reality is animals don't predict human responses well, and so we need another approach. Asha, you mentioned that you have a comment that you want to make.
Yeah, I had a question for the researchers, and you know, because this research, you know, there's only really one place to do this kind of research, and you set your research up to go up on station. And you know, for those on the call who don't know, you know, a lot of times these researchers are kind of planning for this for years, and then they don't know if it's going to launch. They don't know when it's going to launch. They have to kind of the payload sits there for maybe a month, 2 months. I don't know, Siobhan, you might be able to say, so maybe it's down to 2 weeks sometimes, waiting to get on. So you don't have eyes on your payloads for many weeks before it goes up. And so there's some challenges with that. But my question has to do with sort of quality of research metrics, right? So in research fields, even terrestrially, quality is usually assessed on peer review and on citations and on all these like metrics that we all hate, but they're the only ones that we have. So in the same vein, are there metrics of research quality that come out of the research on station, and are the researchers, the PIs, building upon each other's work, right, to kind of stretch and move that research thread along? Or is it a lot of one-offs where they have their own data and it's not as coordinated?
Siobhan,
Yeah, that's a great question.
Loaded.
Well, no, I mean, I think you're really hitting that right. I think, in the National Institutes of Health has funded the tissue chips in space, and that's been it's been a great investment. They did realize there's going to be pretty high failure rate because you're looking at all these tissue chips that some are going to work, some are not. And so I think they have been more one-off, and that's where I'm seeing, because I've come at this, I started before the Tissue Chips in Space project with Space Florida, and have been really working with different implementation partners. And so I think in terms of if we're going to do these more tissue chip platforms or tissue engineering platforms in space, that it's going to take a different type of implementation where it's more concerted, where we're understanding, microscopic changes on ground first. And we can say, look, if we're sending this, we know we need to apply these different things to it to meet a success criteria, and do that on ground first and build in more, like, for example, Mark knows this, cells need 95% humidity, but you've got parts in there that corrode at 40 or 50% humidity. So we're constantly battling this, like, how do we balance? We have pressure changes. It's a closed system, and we have heating and cooling and stimulation, electrical pulses going on in this very small environment. We have gas permeable, but we don't want bubbles. I mean, these are hard to, we could go on forever to try to get it right. So I think the one-off needs to change, that we need to say, are we prioritizing these, tissue chip platforms, tissue engineering platforms, and how are we going to more universally implement them so that we can get to not just integrating and seeing what works and what doesn't, but really getting statistically significant data from them. Yeah, I don't, Kevin, if you had stuff to add to that.
And I think also, the comment about standardizing, I think that's really critical to this effort. I think it's one of the things that came out of the workshop in the fall, actually, with biomanufacturing and Leo, the need for standards. And it's the ASME slogan, setting the standard, right? I think that's one of the things that ASME really has an opportunity to make an impact here, is helping to standardize these biological processes that are going to be essential for exactly those kinds of scientific rigor in comparing types of experiments and the results that come back.
As we get into bioprinting, I hope we learn from all of this that we don't have all these different bioprinters with different capabilities, with getting different readouts, that we have standardization, because this is where I see such commercialization. If you can make, not only make these more volumetric systems, you have more freedom in printing, different co-cultures and volumetric that you can use those for disease modeling on station. You could also use those to bring back for potentially really disrupting the transplantation area. And this is just, this is exciting. I think, for us, I hope, I'm trying to advance from the tissue chip to, can we now produce this more on bioprinting? But then, can we standardize this from the start and really learn from what we've done already with tissue engineering, and do that better, and with de-risking that process.
And could we fabricate it in space rather than having to, like Asha was saying, wait for weeks?
Right. Send up frozen cells and reagents and do it there instead of all of the integration on ground, and saves huge amounts of time in getting ready for flight. Because I think you mentioned, there was a time when we're trying to get ready for flight, and then the flight keeps delaying like 4 times. And so all you end up doing is trying to like redo verification testing instead of just like really get to the source problem and fix it, because you don't know how much time you have. And so that's not a great place to be, where you're just like, okay, let's do it again, let's do it again, let's do it again. And we're not really making progress. But flights have been better, more on time these days.
Yeah, there's also, some question about payload review processes as well, right? I mean, I think that like pace of technology in space has gone way faster than the regulations that are required or that were put into place when, in the 60s and 70s in terms of the launches, right? And so the payload review process is specific to the payload provider. FAA, they give a license to SpaceX. It's SpaceX's responsibility to make sure all of their payloads meet some criteria. And the FAA doesn't have really official purview over, you as a researcher or whoever is putting that integration step, right? And so there's a lot of licensing challenges in this as well. And you get into things like planetary protection, you're bringing things back, what are you going to do about planetary protection? So on the regulatory licensing policy piece of this, I think that there are a lot of challenges that still need to be worked out. And I think there's some really great opportunities if they're, in this as they're planning for the post-ISS world, to make sure that, standards are developed. It takes a long time to develop them, that these things are thought through before a new station or several new platforms might be developed. So it's exciting.
Yeah. No, I think those are all great points. And I think, not to speak for Casis, because I'm no longer at Casis, but, thanks to the work that, Kevin and Siobhan and, Gary's here in the background did. I think that Casis sees that for the duration of the National Lab on the ISS, it's really trying to iterate to try and provide the data that's needed in some of these key areas, right? So I think that one of the first outcomes from the symposium was to narrow the list of areas, and then I think the next exercise is to narrow it further and really try to put some resources behind, verifying that some of this data is real and investable. And I think a big part of that is, let's not reinvent standards that the terrestrial world has already been through and figured out. Let's apply best practices in this environment. So I think that was one of the exciting things is when we started partnering with the folks here at ASME too. And I agree, the whole policy side is totally interesting. I mean, there's lots there. So I don't know if we have time in 10 minutes to talk about all the policy implications. But let's start by let's monitoring that space debris, right?
Yeah, space debris was one that I was thinking of as well. It wasn't even really one of the things that I was thinking about until Asha mentioned it. But anyway, speaking of time, we are, as Mark mentioned, we've got about 10 minutes left. We do want to transition to the Q&A session. And so I see a question here that Anne posted. Please, first of all, remind the audience to submit questions, and hopefully we can get as many in as we can. And we can also follow up with answers to these questions by email if we can't address them all. So the first question here is, we've heard about the benefits of being able to study aging. 6 months in LEO is akin to 10 years on Earth, but why else is it worth sending up an experiment all the way to space? Why incur all those costs, the effort to refit experiment to be done by non-experts? What's the benefit of LEO as a technological platform? Important question.
Yeah, so I think that, we talked on the aging model. I think that there's some other areas that we've already seen some promising results in. So I'm gonna preface this by saying that the ISS was not designed as a pure research facility, and I would say that there's definitely been some inspiration and some STEM components that they're hard to measure there. But with the design of the space station, we've already seen some pretty exciting some results so far. So we have the disease modeling, which I think is still open to interpretation. I think there's questions on, is what happens to humans in space a space flight phenomenon? So a aging that's only relevant in the context of being in space, or there are corollaries for an accelerated aging effect. And if it is that, honestly, that's a huge benefit. I mean, this can be utilized not only as a model to accelerating aging in a healthy human, so taking a healthy human or their tissue and immediately accelerating that aging process and then reversing it by bringing it back. There's just no other platform to do that. And so if you're able to understand the mechanism behind that, that could have huge payoffs. There's also applications in just cellular products. We know that hematopoietic stem cells are used, they've been used clinically for 20 plus years. Maybe this audience is more tuned to that than I am, but there's limitations in the actual manufacturing of those, the expansion of those. And we've seen that the microgravity effects can definitely increase the expansion and the potency of those cells. So the question is, can we understand the mechanism and apply that here on Earth, or can we envision a manufacturing facility in space? And then, you know, on an even smaller level, and this is the question of ROI, is so there's a group that originally started through the Boeing Mass Challenge initiative where they're creating artificial retinas, so very small products, and they're finding that they can manufacture that at a much better quality in space than they can here on Earth. So this is something that, you know, can replace the retina here on Earth, and the early indications is that it's at a level that's better than any other currently available technology. And if you're thinking about actually manufacturing it in space and incurring all those costs, when you're thinking about that type of transplantable item that will likely have high reimbursable rates compared to the cost associated with manufacturing, you know, a very small scale products, you can see that there's the potential there. You know, that's just touching on just a few. There's other areas that seem promising already. And again, this is just using a platform that we're continuing to build as a research platform. And so that's the goal of CASIS over the next decade, is to continue to build that as a research platform so we can identify some of these other areas. And people want to live off of Earth. So there's going to be those applications, and there's going to be, you know, having the ability to do this stuff in space for in-space use, which we didn't have a chance to talk about today, or the ability to have bioengineering capabilities on the moon or on Mars. So there's just, honestly, there are endless, and it does seem a little science fiction at times, but, you know, I wouldn't have believed it 10 years ago.
Yeah, the crystal, you know, anything based on crystal is really important. And these can be, you know, delivery systems or vaccines or drugs that are based on a crystalline that, you know, we've known for a long time that you have a much more higher resolution, better homogeneity in the crystal formation. So you can have formulation, it might be better, and Roche has done that. Delivery systems, you know, any kind of platform that relies on this, and that's where the concept of the bioprinting is do you have, with less sedimentation and less pull, you have a better formation of 3D tissue. So that kind of resolution that you might get in low gravity, I think, has wide applications for biomedical and commercialization and production. So
yeah,
there are a lot of things
blown away last summer when there was a presentation from the Lambda Vision group, I think it was, on the, not just for the artificial retina, you know, the fact that on Earth, artificial retina, you can kind of identify a figure, and then with the retina, you know, developed on the ISS, you could actually identify who that person was. It's that sort of a difference in terms of resolution. So it really is very, very practical. Sorry, Asha, what were you going to say?
No, I was going to say, you know, we looked at all about the investigations on the ISS, and if you believe it or not, tech demonstration and development was actually the highest number. And even outside the biospace, you know, some of the projects have been things like learning about rollout solar arrays, or radiation photometric sensors, or ion turbulence measurements, or attitude determination and control systems. So thermal management systems, things that have to do with like space hardware that people might be testing, right? New star trackers, those types of things that have nothing to do with the research experiments that people might be sending to the station, but have everything to do with space technology development, either ground-based or space-based technology development, that they're trying new technologies there. They're trying to buy down the risk and then seeing if they might be able to put it on their satellite or something like that. So.
All right. I don't know if, Anne, do we have time for one more question? Do we need to wrap this up?
We're going to wrap it up.
Okay. All right, then I guess just like to say thank you to everyone for being here. Thank you to our panel. It's a really stimulating conversation.